The trauma bay was going sideways fast. 2 rangers were already on tables, a third being worked on in the hallway, and the attending on duty, the one the whole department called their best, had just frozen solid, staring at a chest film he didn't understand. That was when the quiet young woman from the administrative office walked in. Nobody paid attention to her. She was the chart clerk. She filed intake forms. She fetched coffee and made sure supply orders were submitted by noon on Fridays. She walked past the frozen attending, looked at the film for exactly 1 second, and said something in a voice so calm and flat it barely registered as human. The wounded ranger on the nearest table turned his head toward her. His eyes, glassy with blood loss and morphine, found her face with sudden, painful clarity, like a man recognizing a lighthouse from a sinking ship. He raised his hand. The effort cost him visibly. His arm shook the entire way up. He held the salute. "Doc," he rasped, Hartwell. The trauma bay went absolutely still. Mercy Ridge Medical Center sat 8 miles from the main gate of Fort Cavazos, which meant its emergency department had seen its share of military-adjacent cases over the years. Training injuries, off-duty accidents, the occasional bar fight 3 blocks from the main gate that came in hotter than advertised. But it was not a military hospital. It was a civilian Level 2 trauma center with a solid regional reputation and a perpetual staffing shortage, and its emergency department was run with iron precision by Dr. Edmund Childs, who had spent 22 years building a reputation as the sharpest emergency physician in Central Texas, and who experienced any challenge to that reputation, real or imagined, as a personal affront. Zoe Hartwell had been hired as an ED administrative coordinator 4 months earlier. She was 28 years old, which made her one of the youngest people on the floor. She had a quiet face, not unremarkable exactly, but deliberately unmemorable, the kind that didn't stay with you after a conversation, and she moved through the department with a peculiar economy of motion, never a wasted step, never an unnecessary gesture. Her personnel file listed a bachelor's degree in health information management from a state university and 2 years of prior experience at a smaller clinic in Abilene. Nothing in the file explained why a woman applying for a chart filing position had listed her emergency contact as the U.S. Department of Defense Records Management Division, Classification Level 4. The hiring manager had called the number. A very polite federal employee had told her, in the tone of someone accustomed to telling people exactly this much and no more, that the listing was standard for certain former government contractors and that Ms. Hartwell had been fully cleared for the position. The hiring manager had shrugged and moved on. There was always a stack of applications to get through. On Zoe's first day, Rowena Blatch had taken one look at her. Young, slight, holding a stack of manila folders like she was actually ready to work, and handed her a key ring for the supply closet. Rowena had been the department's charge nurse for 14 years. She had a system, and the system had a designated place for everyone. Chart clerks restocked forms, maintained the patient tracking board, handled intake paperwork, and stayed out of the medical staff's way. That was the system. It had worked for 14 years. "You'll shadow me this morning," Rowena had told her, in the tone of someone extending a favor. "Watch, learn the layout, don't touch anything clinical. If a physician asks you for something, find a nurse to help them. You don't touch patients. Clear?" "Clear," Zoe had said. Her voice was flat and even, the way a person's voice sounds after years of deliberate practice keeping it that way. Rowena had noticed it, that voice, and filed it somewhere in the back of her mind as mildly strange, then let it go. She had a department to run. For 3 months, Zoe Hartwell became furniture. She processed intakes, filed charts with an accuracy that bordered on unsettling, maintained the tracking board with the kind of obsessive precision usually only found in people who had spent time in environments where small errors carried large consequences. She arrived early, she left late. She ate lunch alone in the family waiting area, not reading anything, not on her phone, just sitting. The medical staff barely registered her existence. Almost. Dr. Amy Tisch, second-year resident still young enough to notice things that experience had not yet trained her to overlook, had clocked Zoe inside the first week. Not anything she could name precisely. It was the way Zoe stood during a trauma code. Everyone else orbited the controlled chaos, executing their assigned roles, focused on their immediate tasks. Zoe stood at the perimeter with her hands loose at her sides, and her eyes moving in a pattern that Amy, after a week of watching, could only describe as tactical. She wasn't watching the patient. She was watching the entire room. Amy had mentioned it to Rowena. Rowena had said, "She's a clerk, Amy. Focus on your patient." The single direct confrontation had come in Zoe's 6th week. A man had been brought in from a construction site. Crush injury, significant blood loss, unstable. Dr. Childs was managing the case personally, brisk and authoritative, the department moving around him with well-rehearsed precision. Zoe had been standing near the tracking board, updating the patient status column. When she took one long look at the monitors above the patient's bed, she said, quietly but clearly, "His pressure is reading falsely high. The cuff placement is wrong. He's dropping." The room paused for half a second. Dr. Childs turned from the patient and stared at her, not with anger initially, but with the particular expression of a person who has heard something so categorically out of place that the brain stalls trying to process it. "Excuse me," he said. "Who are you?" "Zoe Hartwell, administrative coordinator." The pause stretched. "Administrative coordinator," Childs repeated. "Yes, sir." He looked at the cuff placement. He did not assess it. Not really. He looked at it the way a man looks at something he has already dismissed. Then he looked back at her, and his expression had moved into something harder and more recognizable. "Get back to your board, Ms. Hartwell. The next time you feel an urge to comment on clinical matters, I want you to stop. Recognize that you are a chart clerk in a medical facility and not a clinician, and keep your opinions to yourself." 2 minutes later, the patient's pressure crashed. The cuff placement had been wrong. The nurses caught it, repositioned it, and the man was stabilized without lasting damage. Childs did not acknowledge it. Zoe went back to updating the tracking board. That night, Amy found her in the break room, pouring coffee from the carafe that was always terrible and always present. "You were right about the cuff," Amy said. Zoe nodded once, the way a person acknowledges a weather forecast. "How did you know that?" "Blood pressure monitoring is covered in the equipment certification protocols," Zoe said. "I filed them in October." Amy stared at her for a long moment. Zoe took her coffee and went back to work. The call came in on a Thursday afternoon at 4:17. Rowena answered the emergency coordination line, which rang so rarely that 2 of the newer nurses didn't recognize the sound and listened for 90 seconds. When she turned back to the floor, something in her face had changed in a way that stopped 2 separate conversations mid-sentence. "I need bays 1 through 3 cleared," she said, at a volume that carried everywhere. "Mass casualty inbound from Cavazos. Live fire training incident. Multiple critical. ETA 7 minutes. MPs are pulling in now." The word MPs landed in the department like a stone in still water. The lobby doors came open before anyone had finished repositioning equipment. 3 military police vehicles were visible through the glass, and 4 MPs in full tactical gear entered the lobby, directing civilian visitors away from the main corridor, with the quiet, absolute authority that civilian security personnel spent careers trying to project and usually failed at. Dr. Childs emerged from his office, still pulling on his white coat. He looked at the MPs, then at Rowena. "What kind of injuries?" "Blast trauma, ballistic wounds, hemorrhagic shock, multiple patients. First bird is 2 minutes out." Childs squared his shoulders. This was his element. A crisis, a department to command, a clear hierarchy with himself at the top. He began issuing orders, and the machine began to move. Zoe Hartwell was standing at the corner of the tracking board when the MPs entered. She had been holding a pen and a stack of intake forms. When she looked at the MPs, something shifted in her. It was subtle, the kind of change invisible to anyone who hadn't spent time studying military posture, or who hadn't spent time deliberately unlearning it. Her spine straightened by a centimeter. Her chin came up by the same. Her eyes moved across the MP's gear, patches, rank, unit identifiers, with a speed that had nothing to do with curiosity and everything to do with a cataloging system she had spent years burning into muscle memory. Her hands went very still. She set down the intake forms. The first Rangers came through on gurneys pushed by their own people. Operators in blood-soaked combat kit, bearded, faces tight with controlled fear. Rangers were not people who panicked, but they were not people who watched their teammates die without it showing through. And the controlled fear was the effort showing. 3 patients, the 2 less critical, went to bays 2 and 3. The first, Sergeant First Class Theo Wakefield, went to bay 1. Theo Wakefield was 29 years old and appeared to have been partially disassembled. A shaped charge had detonated at a distance that should have been safe but wasn't. His left side, from shoulder to hip, had taken the brunt of it. The team had applied field tourniquets, packed wounds with hemostatic gauze, and done everything right by the standards of field medicine. He had been alive when they loaded him. He was alive now, barely, his blood pressure somewhere in a range that had the monitors issuing a continuous, insistent alarm. The Ranger medic who'd worked him in the field, Corporal Varro, young enough to still have an unfinished look about him, hands caked in his sergeant's blood, came in alongside the gurney and rattled off the field assessment in the fast, practiced cadence of someone who had done this before. Blast injury, penetrating abdominal trauma, suspected internal hemorrhage, 2 tourniquets, hemostatic pack, 2 liters of saline in the field, and his pressure was still dropping. Dr. Childs moved in, gloved and focused, Rowena at his shoulder. "Get me a CT window," he said. "There's no time for CT," Corporal Varro said. Childs looked at him. "I'll make that determination, Corporal." "Sir, his pressure was 60 systolic on the bird and it's been dropping since. He's got a bleeder we didn't get to." "I hear you," Childs said, in the particular voice senior physicians develop, a voice that conveys certainty even when certainty isn't warranted. "We image him first. I need to know what I'm dealing with before I open him up." "You'll lose him before the image loads," Varro said, and his voice cracked slightly on the last word, and he pressed it flat immediately. Childs turned back to the patient. Zoe had come through the bay door so quietly that no one registered her entrance. She was still in her department polo shirt, pale blue, Mercy Ridge logo on the chest, and she stood for 3 seconds at the foot of Wakefield's gurney, eyes moving across the entire patient. Packing placement, tourniquet positions, skin color, the distension pattern of his abdomen, the way his breathing was moving and not moving. "The bleed is retroperitoneal," she said. "CT won't give you what you need fast enough. You have to go in. And before you go in, you need proximal aortic control, or you'll lose the field inside 30 seconds. Childs turned around very slowly. "Miss Hartwell, the packing is correctly placed for an external wound. His pressure isn't responding because it's coming from behind the peritoneum, probably the left common iliac, above the bifurcation." "Security," Childs said without raising his voice. "Please escort Miss Hartwell back to the administrative area." "Edmund." Rowena said it quietly, and the expression on her face was the one that 14 years of emergency nursing had built, the expression that recognized, below the level of argument when the math in a room was not adding up. His MAP is 42. 42. Mean arterial pressure of 42 millimeters of mercury. The threshold for reliable organ perfusion sat around 65. Below 50, the math started getting brutal. "I'm aware," Childs said. "If she's right about the location." "She is a chart clerk, Rowena. His MAP is 42 and it's been falling for 3 minutes. Childs reached for the ultrasound probe. Corporal Varro stepped forward. He wasn't the largest man in the room, but he moved with a compressed, directional certainty. He positioned himself between Childs and the patient's left side. "With respect, sir," Varro said, "I've been watching that woman for 2 minutes. She looked at Sergeant Wakefield the way our forward surgical team looks at our casualties. Not like someone figuring it out, like someone who already knows." Childs stared at him. "She's an administrator, Corporal." "Then she's the best trained administrator I've ever seen look at a trauma patient, sir." The monitor alarm changed tone. One of the nurses said, "Pressure's crashing. in a voice trying hard to stay neutral. Zoe did not wait. She was already at the supply cabinet, the right drawer, with the particular confidence of someone who had memorized the layout not for administrative reasons, and she had a vascular access kit in her hands, and she was back at the table. "I need that ultrasound," she said to the technician. 10 seconds. The technician looked at Childs. Childs's face was doing something complicated. He was a physician who had spent 22 years being right. He was looking at a monitor telling him the room was running out of time. He was looking at a 28-year-old chart clerk holding a vascular access kit with the stance of someone who had held one before. Many times, in conditions that probably didn't have the luxury of this much equipment. He stepped back. It was not approval. It was a man who had run out of road. Zoe moved to the patient's side, and the person who moved to that table was not the woman who had spent 4 months filing intake forms. The physical resemblance was there. Same face, same hands, but everything else had changed. Her movements had the quality of deeply grooved repetition, practiced so many times in far worse conditions that the body had stopped asking the mind for permission. She spoke in clipped, pre-sequenced directives, as if she had already run this entire scenario forward and was now simply executing it. "Rowena, massive transfusion protocol now. 4 units O negative, 4 FFP warmed. Second large bore IV, left antecubital fossa. Pressurize the bag." She looked at Varro. "If this goes sideways, you're on compressions. You know the rate." Varro said, "Yes, ma'am," with a reflex that told its own story. Rowena was already moving. She did not fully understand what was happening, but she understood the voice, and the voice had the frequency of someone who had been in this exact room. Different geography, same room, and had brought people back from it. Zoe pressed her fingers into 3 specific points on the patient's abdomen, reading the resistance and position the way a person reads something in a language they have been fluent in for years. She placed the ultrasound probe, glanced at the screen for 4 seconds, and said, "To no one and everyone, left common iliac. Partial laceration above the bifurcation. The field pack missed it by 2 centimeters." She looked at Childs, who stood against the wall with his arms at his sides. "I'm going to get proximal control with a resuscitative balloon. I've done it without imaging before, in conditions that didn't have a quarter of what this room has." She held his gaze for exactly 1 second. "Do you want to talk about my credentials, or do you want to save him?" Childs said nothing. Zoe took the silence for the answer it was. She worked with a speed that was not rushed. There is a difference, and the room felt it. Rushed is what happens when people are afraid. What Zoe Hartwell was doing had no fear in it at all, only the clean momentum of a body trained past the point where fear serves any useful function. The balloon catheter went in. She inflated it at the correct anatomical landmark without fluoroscopy, guided by her fingers and 4 years of muscle memory from surgical tents in places that had never heard of fluoroscopy, or reliable electricity, or anything beyond what was in the bag she'd carried off the helicopter. The hemorrhage slowed. "Transfusion running," Rowena reported, her voice steadier than she felt. Wakefield's numbers were still bad. They were going to stay bad for a while, but they had stopped plummeting, which was the entire point. Then the monitor changed. The change lasted 11 seconds, and everyone in the room felt those 11 seconds the particular way you feel time when it is carrying something irreversible. The alarm tone rose, sustained, became the flat, single note that meant the heart had stopped keeping time. "Compressions," Zoe said. Varro was already there. He locked his hands over Wakefield's sternum and compressed with the mechanical efficiency of someone who had done this before on a moving vehicle in complete darkness. Zoe did not stop moving. She called for epinephrine, called for the crash cart, adjusted the balloon pressure, called for another unit of blood, all in a voice that never moved off its center. Rowena ran the cart in, and Rowena's hands were shaking, and her technique was perfect anyway, because 14 years of training holds when nothing else does. Tish stood near the door, running a calculation in her head. The kind residents run when they're searching for a foothold in chaos. and kept arriving at the same answer. This was not possible. What was happening in this room was not something a health information management degree produced. The procedure being performed was taught in advanced military trauma courses that most attending physicians had never taken and would not recognize on sight. 37 seconds into compressions, the monitor spiked. Varro felt it through his hands, a single faint muscular contraction, and stepped back. The spike resolved into a rhythm, ugly, irregular, trying. Then it settled. Rowena said, "Sinus rhythm," and her voice did something at the end of that word it had never done in 14 years of charge nursing. The collective exhale that moved through the room was physically audible. Corporal Varro was standing at the foot of the gurney, with his hands covered in blood that wasn't his, and his face held the expression of someone who has just been permitted to keep something he thought he was about to lose permanently. He looked at Zoe. "You're the doc," he said, not a question. Wakefield's eyes opened. Not fully. They were the eyes of someone in severe pain and significant medication, heavy-lidded and glassy, seeing the world through the haze of a body that had just come back from somewhere very bad. But they opened, and they moved, and they found her face. His lips moved. Zoe leaned down. "Doc," Wakefield breathed the word barely clearing his throat. "Hartwell." His right hand came up, slowly, every tendon in the effort visible. He raised it to the side of his head. He held it. Zoe covered his hand with hers, very gently, and pressed it down. "I've got you, Sergeant," she said. "You're going to be okay." He said, "Yes, ma'am," and closed his eyes. Edmund Childs had not moved from the wall. He was looking at the room, at the stabilized patient, at the balloon catheter he had never used and could not have placed, at the chart clerk in a department polo shirt who had walked out of the administrative office and dragged a dying man back. And he did not look like a man who had lost an argument. He looked like a man who had discovered he had been living next to something enormous for 4 months without registering that it was there. General Stuart Patton arrived 40 minutes later. He came with no ceremony. A plain sedan, 2 aides in dress uniform, a face shaped by a long career of carrying serious things without dropping them. The hospital administrator met him at the entrance, uncertain of the protocol, and General Patton moved past her in a polite and absolute way that generals have when they know exactly where they are going. He walked into the trauma bay, where Zoe was still standing, now writing handwritten notes on a trauma assessment form she'd found on the supply cart. He stopped. They looked at each other for a long moment. There was history in the silence, not warm, exactly, but old and true, the kind that exists between people who have been through the same things in the same places and have not spoken about it since. "I got the call that we had a critical casualty en route to a civilian facility," Patton said. "I was on the phone with the base surgeon about evacuation options when they told me which hospital had received him." He paused, and then they told me the name on your administrative coordinator badge. Zoe said nothing. "I told the pilot to hold position," Patton said, "because I knew the sergeant was going to be fine." Dr. Childs, who had remained in the bay, said, "General, could someone explain who she is?" Patton turned to address the room, which had acquired a small audience. Rowena, Amy, the 2 rangers, several nurses who had drifted in during the aftermath. "Zoe Hartwell held the rank of captain in the United States Army Medical Corps," he said. "She was assigned to the 75th Ranger Regiment as a forward surgical team leader for 4 years. 2 tours in Afghanistan, 1 in Syria, 1 in an operating environment I am not going to name in this room." He paused. "She was one of the most capable trauma surgeons this Army has ever embedded with a direct action element. Her file is classified at the department level." The administrator said, "We ran a background check. There was nothing. There was nothing because she asked us to seal it." Patton said simply, "We honored that request." Child said very quietly, "She's a surgeon." "Was," Zoe said. The word was quiet and flat and very final. "I surrendered my medical license 18 months ago," she said. "I went through the process. It's done." She set the assessment form on the cart. I applied for this position because I wanted to be near a hospital without practicing medicine. I just wanted to be near it. The room held. Your brother, Patton said. Zoe's face didn't change. Something underneath it did. Specialist Daniel Hartwell, 75th Ranger Regiment, 3rd Battalion, Patton said, and his voice had gone careful in the way of a man choosing every word. Killed in action 14 months ago in an incident I also cannot name in this room. He was one of 4 casualties that night. 3 of them survived. He did not look away from her. Captain Hartwell operated on all 4 of them. Nobody asked the obvious question. It sat in the room fully visible, and no one reached for it. I had every drug, every instrument, every technique, Zoe said, and her voice was still level, still flat, still the thing she had spent years making it. The protocol says I did everything right. By every standard I was trained to, I did everything right. She stopped. He was the only one I lost. She didn't say anything else. She didn't need to. The thing she had been hiding for 4 months was not a set of credentials. It was the weight behind them. The knowledge that competence is not armor, that the best training in the world does not guarantee the outcome, and that the person who knows this most acutely is the one who has tested it at the cost of something irreplaceable. She had given up surgery not because she doubted her ability, but because she had learned, at the worst possible cost, that ability was not the whole answer. And she had not found anything she could live with on the other side of that knowledge except smaller work. Quieter work. Work that did not put her in the position of being the reason. I just wanted to file charts, she said. That's all I wanted. General Patton stood straight. He raised his hand and held the salute. The 2 Rangers came to attention and followed without a word. Varro straightened from the wall and saluted with a precision that contained everything he wasn't saying out loud. Amy Tish, who was a second-year resident and had never saluted anyone in her life, found herself standing with her arms perfectly at her sides and her chin up, which was as close as she had. Rowena Blatch said nothing. She pressed her lips together hard and looked at the ceiling for a moment and looked back. Edmund Childs stood still for a long time. Then he said, Mrs. Hartwell, I owe you an apology. Several of them. The words came with visible effort. He was not a man practiced at this, and the difficulty was entirely apparent. I dismissed you, repeatedly, on the basis of a job title. You were right about the patient in October. You were right today. Whatever you choose to do going forward, I was wrong about you from the first day you walked in here. Zoe looked at him. Her expression did not carry vindication. It carried something more like recognition, one exhausted person acknowledging another. You're a good physician, Dr. Childs, she said. You're genuinely good at what you do. You just didn't know what you were looking at. He nodded once, the nod of a man accepting something he cannot dispute. Neither did I, she added quietly, and she was no longer talking about him. The military transport team arrived 20 minutes later to transfer Wakefield to the main army facility. Before they moved him, Varro stopped in the doorway. He reached into the breast pocket of his combat shirt and came out with a worn coin. Dull bronze, the kind the army gives and the army keeps with the weight of a lot of different knights pressed into it, and set it in Zoe's hand without a word. She looked at it for a moment. He's going to make it, Varro said, because of you. She closed her hand around the coin. Do your after-action report correctly, she said. I want documentation that the shaped charge had a defect. Someone needs to fix it before the next training cycle. Varro said, yes, ma'am, and meant all of it, and walked out. The doors closed behind the military escort. The trauma bay emptied slowly, the way rooms do after events that leave a residue on the air. The janitorial staff came in with their cart. The monitors were reset. The supply cabinet was restocked. Zoe Hartwell picked up the stack of intake forms she had set down 2 hours ago, straightened them against the counter, and walked back to the tracking board. There were 14 patients in the department. 11 needed their charts updated. 2 had pending insurance verifications that someone would need to call about in the morning. 1 had been waiting on a room assignment for 40 minutes and deserved to know what was happening. She picked up her pen. The emergency department moved around her. Loud and necessary and relentless, the way it always had, the way it would long after tonight, became just another Thursday in the log. She went back to work.